My name's Tommy. This is my talk I'm going to be doing for the next half an hour on artificial intelligence and computers that actually play video games for research purposes, and sort of like, why do we do that? Why is that an interesting thing to do? And also subsequently, where computers now actually surpass humans, and where we've actually still got a chance to fight back. Quick introduction of myself. I'm Tommy Thompson. I'm a senior lecturer, currently still part-time working at Anglia-Ruskin University, which is the other university in Cambridge. Prior to that, I actually worked as a computer science lecturer at the University of Derby. My actual background is an academic. I went through my PhD in artificial intelligence, specialising in games. And I kind of got this buzz a couple of years ago to take a lot of my research interests. I publish a lot of academic papers in this space to sort of like broadly disseminate this and try and talk about it a little bit more to a wider audience, because this stuff's really cool, but often the technical jargon makes it kind of difficult for people to really engage with it. So a couple of things I do is I now work freelance as a consultant in the games industry. I work with other game studios. I also make my own stuff. My game Sure Footing, alongside with my team at Table Flip Games, is upstairs. Please come and try it if you haven't already. We work really hard on it. We think it's cool. But the thing that actually, the scary thing is most people know me in the wider world as a YouTuber. So I started a series on YouTube about 4 years ago now called AI in Games, where I talk about research and applications of AI in video games. So I tell you how an AI works in a video game. If you really like a game and you go, how did that actually work? For example, the most famous video I've made is about Alien Isolation. I actually tell you how it works. This is actually based on how they did it, and has actually been ratified by people I know who worked on that game and say that is actually authentic. But I also look at academic work. So one of my more recent videos was about 15 years worth of research that's been happening all over the world in building AI that can play STARCRAFT, and why that's interesting. And I'm going to come back to that in a bit. Now, I always think this is really important to kind of get people talking about AI, and kind of particularly now because it's such a huge buzzword. Everybody's talking about it. It's became like the new thing that's just dominating the headlines. And there's a lot of rhetoric around it. It kind of sensationalizes AI in weird ways. We make it sound like they're way smarter than they are. But also when you start asking people about artificial intelligence, they're like, oh yeah, like Skynet. Which is really funny, because I think now more people know what Skynet is than have actually seen a Terminator film. Like my grandmother, he's even referred to Skynet once or twice. I'm like, oh, like Terminator. She's like, what's that? And as you can see, this is just a quick pull off Google image. I just typed in AI apocalypse and that's what you get. And almost exclusively it's Terminator, or robotic-like things that are kind of removed from humanity. Now, if you have no real kind of understanding of AI on a kind of scientific level, it's all right. The kind of simplest, purest explanation I can give is we deal with software, and we call them agents in this space, and it's about just making intelligent decisions. And there's two things that have to be true for an AI system to actually be an AI system. It has to be autonomous, which means it makes a decision entirely by itself. It doesn't require our input or our like us telling it what to do in order for it to make that decision. But it also has to be rational, which means it makes the best possible decision it can at a given point in time. This is often the thing that causes the AI apocalypse spiel, because something that's rational doesn't necessarily mean it's morally or ethically just. So it's kind of like, it's a little bit intense. So yeah, like, why is AI so important in games? Like, when you get to AI in the games industry, it's so important. We use it everywhere. And it's mostly about crafting experiences. We're trying to build some sort of interactive environment which has got some sort of story behind it, and we want to elicit emotions in the player. So you're trying to craft this interesting experience. And I think we've already got a couple of devs in the audience who are like, yeah, this is a big problem we're trying to solve. And so here's like a number of ways I can think that you actually use it, such as basic non-player characters in like Fear. You have directors in Left 4 Dead, which is actually controlling the game as you play it, and it's changing the world around you. It actually sends zombies to come and attack you. It isolates who it wants to attack. But also you're creating companions, such as Elizabeth Comstock from BioShock Infinite. And she is actually arguably the protagonist of that story, so she's absolutely critical to that narrative. And this young woman hangs around with you for the whole time, but she's got to come across as an interesting person in her own right. And so they kind of work to kind of build and kind of refine that character. But it's also about how it can be used to build games as well, such as procedural content generation in No Man's Sky, or even creating like fluid animations, which is something Ubisoft have been doing a lot recently in the likes of For Honor. But also there's all this other weird stuff that we don't really think about. There's even just creating things that are kind of part and parcel of how our game works. So like The Sims is a really popular series of games, and one of the things that The Sims has to do a lot is make sure that The Sims actually behave reasonably intelligently. And there's a huge amount of work in The Sims 4 about just making sure that a character can do two things at once and it actually makes sense. So for example, I'm able to stand here and talk to you while having a cup of coffee in my hand, and periodically, maybe when I stop for a breath, I go and have a sip. Before that, The Sims actually couldn't do those two things at the same time. They would have a conversation, then completely blank you, and then come back and have the conversation. And that just breaks it kind of breaks that fluidity and that immersion. But then like weird stuff that nobody thinks about. So the Drivatar in Forza Horizon, that actually watches how you play and it tries to replicate you. It actually does it reasonably well. But also there's been research in games like Tomb Raider where they actually watched how people play the game and they realized people don't actually play Tomb Raider the way that the designers think people play Tomb Raider. Oh, there's a giant bear over there. Do I have to fight it? Oh, hey, if I just kind of like shimmy along here and jump over that bit, I could just avoid the bear. And they're like, oh yeah, we built this bear sequence and it's great. And all these people are like, screw this noise, I'm going that way. Really lots of really weird stuff. And I've done a whole bunch of videos on this kind of topic if you're interested. But so why make an AI play a game? That always seems like a really weird thing. And it's actually been like this kind of slowly growing research field now for about 20 years. And I've been sort of in this space now for over 10 now, probably longer than I would care to admit. And one of the big reasons that you get an AI to play a game is that games are great benchmarks. If you think about it, games are this really cool way to kind of reduce and condense real world problems into a nice and accessible format. So we think about long-term decision making, you're thinking about like hand-eye coordination, thinking about reactive responses to circumstances. Games do all of this, but also they have very real reward and penalty structures. So this allows you to be able to do things without, particularly in the real world, without people getting hurt. So you want to have a character in a video game that learns not to walk through fire? Cool. That's also a lot less expensive than building a robot that has to learn not to walk through fire. There's also a couple of health and safety regulations probably in there somewhere because you're building a lot of things and then setting them on fire and etc, etc. But also even things like flight simulators are a great way to essentially test systems that can learn to fly without actually having to build aircraft. And it's become an increasingly popular thing that you build a tool or a kind of an ecosystem around a game to then get an AI to learn to play it. And two actual contemporary examples, these are two things happening right now. This is the STARCRAFT 2 learning environment, which has been developed by Google DeepMind. And this is actually what we call feature layer abstraction, looking at a current map in STARCRAFT 2. And this is all the different things that they're able to isolate out of it, that they can pump into an AI system to learn more about how to actually play STARCRAFT. And this one at the bottom, this is the Vizdoom API, which has been kind of worked on in part by Facebook. And it's Doom. It's classic 1990s Doom. But over here, they've actually started writing these extra tools that are beginning to isolate the game space, the characters, the environment, and the enemies. And the idea is that it actually learns to play Doom entirely just by looking at visual data. They don't give it any interaction of like, you have a gun, you know how to fire the gun, what gun you are, where you are in the world. It has to figure all that out just by reading raw video data. And it's actually becoming really good at it too. It's kind of weird. And a lot of stuff you have to consider. This is the last big technical bit, and after this, it's all videos, so we're okay. There's a couple of like really big problems you start thinking about, and there's a lot of numbers that get bounced around here. First of all is like the state space. So if you've got a game, and think about any game that you like to play. It could be a board game, it could be a card game. You could be playing like a crossword in the newspaper or something like that. You just have to start thinking about like the state space. What are the all possible permutations of that game? So in a video game, this is actually really bad. You have to start thinking about every possible location that a player can be in, every possible location that every other object can be in. These are unique configurations. We call that a state. And this gets ridiculous. You're often talking numbers that I couldn't write on this wall because of how big they become. And I've actually got a couple of numbers that I'll bounce around later on for even classic board games, which are ridiculously big. But also then like the branching factor. So if you're in a state, how many different things can you do? Even something as simple as chess, you have a configuration of the board, and then how many different things can you move at that point in time, and how far can they go? Every one of them is a possible action. So even one state can have a huge branching factor because you can do like 20, 40, 100 different things in that space. Another thing that's really important, and this is actually one of the reasons why in some spaces we're still beating AI, is about determinism. Can I know what's going to happen if I do something? If I toss a coin, can I always predict what the outcome's going to be? Randomness is actually something that's a real big problem. And also perfect information. Do I know everything about the game that I'm playing? So say you're playing a board game, you actually do know everything for the most part because you see the board. But you're playing a lot of video games or games with chance, such as poker. You don't know everything. You don't know what other cards other players have and stuff like that. So if I was to kind of like list a bunch of things like AI that plays games and what AI can now do, what can it crush? Like in what areas are we just got no chance of now competing? And the first thing to fall, as it were, was a lot of classic board games. Things that we've actually become quite accustomed to, which in some regards, it's kind of scary because AI is able to, like at a university level, some of these are homework assignments now. So simple games that we like to play, like Noughts and Crosses or Tic-Tac-Toe. Tic-Tac-Toe has a complete enumerated state space of about 5,470 unique configurations. You can write a computer program to solve that in an afternoon. One of my homework assignments when I was doing my master's degree was to write a Sudoku solver. It took me 2 days, and it can solve any Sudoku puzzle you give it in about less than 3 seconds. Because it's actually not that huge a state space. It's actually a relatively small space. The more interesting problem in Sudoku is whether you can enumerate every possible solution to that particular configuration of the thing that you give it. And they've even now written effective AI solvers that can now tell you every possible solution in like a minute. But things like drafts and chess, these have actually been defeated effectively for over 20 years now. I think probably the most famous one is chess was effectively wiped out in about 1996, and again in 1997 as IBM worked on what was called Deep Blue. It was a computer system that played against Garry Kasparov, a Russian pro player who at the time was the #1 chess player in the world. And it managed to effectively eliminate him using, it's a brute force system. They effectively embedded knowledge in it. They told it all these different really good strategies to play at different parts in the game, mostly at the start and the end. And then it had a little bit more freedom to do what it wanted in the middle. Now, to give you a bit of an idea about state space problems, chess has a state space configuration of 10 to the 120. So if you've got a pen and paper and you get 20 minutes to spare later, write the number 10 and then write 120 zeros after it. That's roughly the number of unique configurations of chess that exist. And we solved that 20 years ago. That's relatively small fry. And then meanwhile, drafts, for example, has actually been mathematically solved. Drafts or checkers, however you want to consider it. This was actually work that was done in University of Alberta about the early 2000s. The groundbreaking thing that they discovered through their Chinook bot that they called it, is that if you actually play optimally, if one person plays the best possible game of drafts they can, and the next person plays the best possible game of drafts they can, it's a draw. Which doesn't sound that dramatic. But it proves two things. One, that you can actually create a bot that, if you have two bots that are perfect players, you can always guarantee this. Two, it actually proves that the game is balanced to a relative degree. But they actually have it online. You can actually go into the University of Alberta's website and you can play the Chinook bot. They dumbed it down for public consumption. But you can actually play it. It will probably beat you. You can maybe get about a 5% chance of beating it if you're really good at drafts. But yeah, you can easily Google that and actually try it out against it if you fancy it. But moving into video games, you start thinking about, oh yeah, like classic games that we all really love and stuff. And Super Mario Brothers was one that in academia about 10, 15 years ago, we were really jazzed about, like Mario. Yeah. AI won't be able to play Mario. And like a couple of weeks later, like, oh, right, okay. It's actually a lot easier than we thought. Because at the end of the day, all an AI has to do is run forward and not die. Such as this. This is the Infinite Mario API. It's actually based on a clone of Mario that was written by Notch, the guy that made Minecraft. Or one of the guys that made Minecraft. And this is a bot that was written by Robin Baumgarten, who's actually more famous these days in game development as the guy that made Line Wobbler and Wobble Garden. And this was actually a relatively simple bot. It uses a technique we call A-star search, which is sort of the most vanilla AI bot thing you can actually use. And it was entered into this competition where we were trying to see how great an AI could be at playing a game of Mario. And what you're seeing is this red line that it's doing, it's actually plotting the optimal path to get to the end of the screen. And it even cheats, as you see there, in a couple of cases. But it's always, every frame of the game, it's recomputing that path and figuring out what the most optimal thing is. And you see it making these dodges and jumps that you think are actually impossible, but it has such reactive and minute control of its movement that it's able to just isolate exactly at that point in time how to avoid getting hurt. such as this, when you've just got a ridiculous number of characters and it somehow just manages to make its way through it. Even things like Tetris. Like Tetris is something that we're actually quite fond of. Again, a kind of classic arcade game, or classic video game certainly, you know, coming back to the Game Boy days and the like. This is also a really simple problem in some respects. This is actually something that, again, sort of a homework assignment. This is what we call in computer science as a bin packing problem. It's actually the sort of thing nowadays where, okay, show of hands, how many people actually buy stuff off Amazon? So Amazon's always got this thing now where they're trying to make sure that they maximize deliveries, but also like how many deliveries they can achieve within a certain area, geographic space. And one of the things they actually do is use the same solvers that you would use to write an AI for Tetris, and they use it to pack their vans, because they want to make sure that all the packages are placed in the correct place in the van so that they get to the next place and the next thing that's at the front of the back of the van, I guess, ready for them to take out is the item that's next on their list of people that they're going to visit. And they always prioritize the route so that it's always an optimal route through like a housing area, and you're always taking out the next available item. And also they try and pack it in such a way that it doesn't fall over. That's why sometimes you buy an SD card, pack it like that, and it comes in a box like this. It's bin packing. And just to give you a really, again, another really simple example of this, here's a really simple and effective, this is actually just written in a programming language called Lua, and someone effectively just sat and wrote a Tetris bot that can play this really, really quickly. And yeah, it's actually not that exciting once you realize, oh, this is actually a lot easier than we actually think it is at times. And having said this, I was actually playing Puyo Puyo Tetris with a couple of people on the Switch over at Gonzo's in town like a couple of days ago, and I was getting trounced by the other guys I was hanging out with, and then you just see this and I just feel really, really bad about myself. I'm just generally incapable of, yeah, moving on. So that's like things that we have no chance of coming back from. AI of effectively computing in general has just trounced us there. We won't be able to kind of reclaim any sort of space there. But there's a lot of other genres that are now like slowly that are being chipped away at in a number of interesting ways. First up, first-person shooters. One of the things that's really interesting about this is when you start dealing with machine learning technology, which is the big thing these days in the press, is that these are very, very good at isolating very specific reactive decisions to specific problems. Shooters are a horribly great place for them to test this. So if you want to be able to get headshot from the other side of a map with a pistol, you can train an AI to effectively do that, because they'll begin to even address for bullet drag and the wind friction that you might add to a particular game. So something like Battlefield, which has a little bit of pseudo-realistic bullet physics in there, they can actually begin to compensate for that. They'll actually begin to address it. One of the things, two things that are actually existing in this space which are really interesting is that we actually stopped worrying about whether we can actually make a bot that can play simple first-person shooters. So this is something called the 2K Bot Prize that ran about 10 years ago. This wasn't about trying to create an AI that could play the game. It was about, if it bothers to load, this was actually about an AI that could fool the player into thinking it wasn't an AI. So the perspective you're seeing right now is actually of a human judge. This is a deathmatch that's running in Unreal Tournament 2004, and the judge's job is to try and establish which of the characters in this map, someone just killed the judge. Oh, because they got the wrong guess, that was it. Effectively, their job is to see if they can isolate which person in that match was actually the AI bot. And a lot of the time they're getting to a point where they could learn about how humans were actually playing the game and then replicate that behavior in a computer. And it actually got to the point that eventually they were able to trick humans into thinking that other humans were actually robots, and AI actually won the competition several years ago. It caused a whole bunch of controversy. I'm not getting into that. But even like some more contemporary stuff, like with bigger shooting games, like more contemporary shooting games, which are louder, they're larger in scale, like the state space and action space is huge. So this is something that Electronic Arts have been hiding for a year or so now in their seed department. This was something that I heard about a long time ago, and they finally made it public so I can actually talk about it without getting into trouble. So this is a machine learning system. It's actually convolutional neural networks using the Q-learning algorithm, if I remember right. They're playing Battlefield 1, which is a big shooting game that came out a couple of years ago. And there's no humans in this game at all. This is all just AI trying to play it. And you can see that it's a bit hit and miss, but there's a lot of weird stuff going on. You can see all these cubes. So right now, the AI is not very good at being able to strategize. A lot of games like Battlefield, it is predicated on teamwork. It's predicated on being able to share resources, such as ammunition and health packs. You can rearm one another, you can heal one another. The cubes are actually there to give health and ammo. And they've recognized the need to prioritize that and get more health and get more ammo. They're not very good at sharing with each other yet. And you can even see they kind of have trouble like wandering around, but every now and then they do something like that. And this is just something that's been started in the last year. And one of the things that Electronic Arts is focusing on, a few kinks to iron out there, I forgot that bit was in there. One of the things that they're really focusing on is if they can actually start doing this on a much larger scale, they can use this to stress test their games as they're being developed. What's the point in running a private beta with a bunch of screaming teenagers when you can actually just get a bunch of AI to play the game for you and begin to establish an awful lot of issues with server load and actual gameplay bugs without the human element in it, which is both exciting and terrifying. But another one which is slowly being chipped at is fighting games. Fighting games have always been this really weird space. It's all about 1v1 combat, and it's about trying to come up with appropriate strategies to do at a certain point in time. So if someone's facing off against you, you've got to think 2-3 steps ahead of them. Essentially, fighting games are sort of speed chess. You're always trying to think 2-3 moves ahead of your opponent in order to kind of build up some sort of combo, knock them down, take them out, etc. There's not been a huge amount of academic work in this space, and if it has, it's actually been quite primitive, I think, because fighting games are often rather complex and rich game spaces to work in. There's actually been some really cool stuff. I did a video on this last year where this is the reboot of Killer Instinct, which is still in development by Iron Galaxy, which is owned by Microsoft. And what they did was created this thing called the Shadow System, which uses a technique called case-based reasoning. And what it does is it actually watches you play, and within 3 fights, it can play as you. You end up standing next to another character that looks exactly like you, and then you realize it starts beating you up like you would. And this is a really interesting tool because they're able to effectively replicate professional players, people that play at large competitive level. You can find out whether or not you could ever stack up against that person instead of actually going, okay, well, I need to get to this tournament, I need to beat these 20 guys to get in the final against this person. No, you can fight their shadow, and that shadow fights like them, and they can continue to update and improve it. But also, it's actually really great. I like fighting games. I actually played a lot of Killer Instinct when it came out. I began to spot all the gaps in my strategy because it could counteract them. And also sometimes I'm like, oh God, I'm actually that transparent. I'm really obvious when I go in to do that combo because I figured out I could counter it, break it, and then knock the guy down. So I need to figure out how to get better at this game. And this actually helped me like kind of gradually improve my own skill set in that space. If you're interested in it, I've put a link, I've put a picture at the end to what the video that I actually did on this. So this is where we're kind of losing ground, but there's still a bunch of stuff that we actually still dominate. And they can't beat us yet. They're working on it. I like to say that like they, as if it's like an evil wave of autonomous machines coming to destroy us. I'm kind of feeding into the AI apocalypse spiel at this point. And really weird ones, Pac-Man, or Ms. Pac-Man specifically. And you might think, hang on a minute, they're very good at, they're doing Battlefield, they're doing fighting games, but we can't beat Ms. Pac-Man yet. Can anyone tell me the difference between Pac-Man and Ms. Pac-Man? No one know? All right. The ghosts, in the original one, all the ghosts, Inky, Blinky, Pinky, and Clyde, all had exactly strict behaviors. They always did exactly the same thing at any given point in time. Human players and AI players could quite easily defeat it because eventually when you get really good at it, you know exactly what the ghosts are going to do at any point in the game. In Ms. Pac-Man, at every junction, there is a possibility that a ghost will do something entirely random and deviate entirely from its behavior that it's supposed to have. This breaks the game in some regards. I talked about determinism and being able to predict the outcome of future behavior. That shifts Pac-Man from deterministic to Ms. Pac-Man, which is non-deterministic. And this means you can't predict anymore. You have a very good idea of what they might do, but they might just do something completely different, and you really can't anticipate that with any sort of confidence. And as such, AI has been really struggling to kind of get up to that, to actually surpass human players. They're nowhere near it at this point. Here's a good example. This is a little old now. This is about 10 years ago. This is Ice Pambush 3, which was a bot written in Ritsumeikan University in Japan. And that is an AI bot. that is actually playing Ms. Pac-Man in its entirety. At that time, so this was about 9 years ago, this was the world champion. This was the best Ms. Pac-Man player in the world for a computer. Not many, we've only actually seen a couple of marginal gains on top of that. They've not managed to get to that point. It's still nowhere near actually beating human performance in this area. However, there has been some very recent research, which isn't actually published yet. I only know about it because I reviewed it, where they've been able to beat all current top scores in this space. And they're using this new thing called an ensemble system, where it's not just one AI brain, it's like 10. And they vote. So the system goes, what should I do here? And all the different AI systems essentially argue and vote for what they think should do. And eventually it takes the common consensus of these different systems to make the best decision. We're still winning in Ms. Pac-Man, strangely, like after all this time. It's kind of hard to understand, but there you go. So STARCRAFT. STARCRAFT is actually becoming an incredibly more prominent problem in this space. And I just did a video on it, as I mentioned earlier. So remember how I said chess had a huge state space? It was what, 10 to the 120, so 10 plus 120 zeros. Recently, Google DeepMind had actually found a way to win against professional players at Go. Now, Go had a state space of 10 to the power of 174, so that's 10 with 174 zeros at the end of it, which is 1 million trillion more states than chess. It's also 2,000 years older. That doesn't have any bearing on it, but it's a much more significant problem. STARCRAFT makes Go look like a walk in the park. I actually don't know what the fully enumerated state space of STARCRAFT is, but 10 to 174 doesn't scare you. I have no idea what STARCRAFT is. It terrifies me. And this is why a lot of AI research, as soon as Lee Sedol had been defeated by Google DeepMind's AlphaGo system, Google turned around and right, what's next? STARCRAFT. And they have invested a tremendous amount of resources in this. And as I showed you earlier, there was the screenshot of the SC2LE. And that was the StarCraft 2 learning environment. They are now pumping all sorts of resources into it. They are nowhere near being able to actually build intelligent machine learning systems that can play StarCraft. They can do really basic things. Not that great yet in the kind of larger game space. And also nowhere near actually being able to play humans. So here's a video. This is an event that took place in about the autumn of 2017. This isn't StarCraft 2, this is the original StarCraft. And StarCraft's, like I said, it's got a long history of actually writing AI that can play StarCraft. And this has been going on for about 15 years now. And this took place at Sejong University in South Korea. This is embarrassing, I think is actually the appropriate term. So over to the right here, we've got a bot that is actually playing, I think it's playing as the, it's playing as Protoss there, I think. Over to the left, this gentleman here, Song Byung-gu, who goes by, I'm trying to remember his handle at this particular point in time. Song Byung-gu is one of the most highest rated professional StarCraft players in South Korea. Now, if you don't play StarCraft, there's a significant difference between pro players in South Korea versus everywhere else. It is considered in many respects to be a bit of a national sport in that country. And I think Song Byung-gu at one point, Stork, actually, that's his name, I forgot, was, I think, the third best StarCraft player in the world. So this competition was against 5 different bots from all over the world who they said, what we're going to do is we're going to get them to play this gentleman and see how good they are against him. It took him 27 minutes. Not to beat one of them, to beat all of them. Usually a StarCraft professional game can run anywhere from like 30 minutes to an hour or whatever else. The fastest defeat took place in 4.5 minutes. And these are considered to be the most groundbreaking computer-controlled StarCraft players in the world. And he kind of made us all look like morons. One of the big reasons for this, again, like I said, the state space is huge. But it's also about the number of intelligent actions you can make in a second. You can actually, if you watch Stork's hand, his hands are going like crazy. One of the big things that's really important in StarCraft is the number of unique actions per minute that you execute by hand, moving units around, telling them what to do, conceiving strategies and whatever else. AI can operate at that level. They can make those decisions really quickly, but they're missing the kind of larger context and it's not quite there yet. So I think we've still got a couple of years maybe before they kind of trounces there, but StarCraft are actually doing really well there. And it's really interesting. This, like, I said that he does it in half an hour, but you notice the video is like nearly 3 hours long. It was like a national event. This is recorded off a television event. This was actually live on television. People could sit down and watch this event. They had commentators, they had interviews with the university, with the bot writers, with Stork himself. Like, it was a big spectacle. And then we kind of looked like fools. But there you go, STARCRAFT, another one. I think the most recent one, and I literally just did a video on this that came out this week, multiplayer online battle arenas, so things like League of Legends and Dota. This is becoming increasingly popular. In fact, the video I just did this week is about why MOBAs are the next space that people are going to tackle. Now, I think there's a lot of interesting research you can do in MOBAs outside of actually playing it, but there has been some work in that area. In fact, so this was at the Invitational, which is the largest it's the largest event in the Dota 2 Pro circuit. This took place last August. Down in the corner, this gentleman goes by the name of the handle of Dendy. He was one of the most high-ranked Dota 2 players in the world. And he is competing in a 1v1 context against this bot written by OpenAI, which is a company co-founded, among others, by Elon Musk. And he actually, it's about a 20-minute match. It's just 1v1 in Dota 2. And he gets defeated by the bot, which took a lot of people by surprise at the time. Well, holy crap, like, he is considered to be, like, Dendy, I think, is like one of the kind of, at his peak, was like one of the top 5 players in the world of Dota 2. And this was streamed live on the internet, so people all over the world actually saw this happen. Now, it's a big deal, yeah, he got defeated by an AI system, but it's also not that big a deal, because anyone who plays MOBAs know that MOBAs are a 5v5 game, and you have to work in a kind of cooperative capacity across this very large map, solving, kind of competing in numerous areas and trying to maintain a base strategy and ensuring that you've got that consistency to hold your ground and push forward against the other team. Fighting in a 1v1 context, eventually a human is going to fail. Like I said earlier, like, machine learning in particular is very good at doing very reactive things in very specific contexts. And OpenAI trained their bot for 5 months in preparation for this. It was running on cloud systems. It was essentially being fed good strategies based on what existing data had came from professional players. They'd actually harvested data and said, right, this is actually a good behavior, replicate that in this context if you can. But it also then learned and refined and matured them the more it was playing them. So this is just getting started in this area. We've still got the advantage here, but pretty soon it's going to be really interesting to watch teams of 5v5 actually play off against one another and see whether humans can still come out on top. One that's actually just started in the last year is Minecraft. There's 2 projects that are happening in this space. First of all, Project Malmo, which is actually coming out of Microsoft Research in Cambridge, here in the UK. They've wrote this system where it's machine learning bots actually learning to play Minecraft. Can they just do basic problem solving? Can they wander around in that space? Can they even build things in this space? And more recently, there's actually a competition that's happening right now. It's coming out of New York University. It's being spearheaded actually by a friend of mine, where it's procedural generation systems that are learning to build villages and towns and like kind of sensible structures within Minecraft. And this is something that, like I say, very early days, we still got a long way to go. So, going to wrap it up. What other things could we do? What other problems I think are really interesting? Now, purely because every child under the age of 10 has mentioned it, Battle Royale has been sitting in the back of my head the whole time I've been here. This is Fortnite by Epic Games, probably the biggest game on the planet right now. Yeah, particularly also if you're under a certain age, probably the only game that you're actually playing at the moment. It's a pretty good game too. But why not? It's actually a really interesting problem because Battle Royale games are big on, so if you don't know the basic premise, there's usually about 99 to 100 players that are in a map. You drop them into it from the air, they land, they have to acquire resources such as health, shields, guns, etc. And then they have to go out and eliminate everybody else in the map. And Fortnite is really big on building. You can actually see all these structures that exist here. This is because these players are able to actually build fortifications. And sometimes they build just ridiculously large structures. So there's a lot of problems here. You've got to actually land. You've got to be able to navigate the environment. You've got to find the appropriate resources you need. You then got to be able to stay alive because you're fighting sometimes against 25 groups of 4 or 99 other players in the map, taking them out, gradually making your way, because as you're there, the map begins to shrink. They have a circle that if you're outside the circle, you die. So players have to continually move into this ever shrinking circle and then face off against one another in like the last moments. Do you play aggressive? Do you play passive? I've won Fortnite several times. I often do it by not fighting people. I let other people take each other out. I literally won a game earlier, was it last week, by hiding underneath a structure and let 2 people fight it out as the circle shrank, and I won hiding in a cupboard. I can imagine they weren't happy. I was over the moon because I had very little health. I was running out of ammo. I'd killed 4 other people to get there, and I just saw these 2 groups of 2 people like just going at each other. I'm like, screw this noise. I'm going to hide. And also the amount of times in PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, I've actually got kills by hiding in a bathroom and sitting in the bathtub. People come in, is there any resources in the bathroom? There's a shotgun pointed at the side of their head. So lots of really interesting strategies to kind of solve, but also open world, whether it's offline and online. You've got a lot of really interesting problems there to kind of solve. You've got economies. You're actually going to be able to acquire resources to go and buy new items. And you have skill trees. You have to unlock new powers and skill sets. But even just being able to wander around the world and not look like a moron, which is actually a really difficult thing to do. There's a really cool example of this. I don't know, you might have seen this on Twitch. There's a fella over in the United States who's been writing an AI bot that's been trying to drive around Grand Theft Auto 5. And all it does is he spawns the car in the world and he just leaves it alone to see if it can wander around. The first 2 minutes is always fine. It's just sort of, it's chilled, it's driving around, it's being well behaved. And within like 5 minutes, it's being chased by the SWAT, there's a helicopter after it, it's killed like 20 people, it's driving through the desert, and it doesn't really know what it's doing because it's based purely on camera information it's reading from in front of it. So it reads the road and it's like, okay, I think I'm good. And then the SWAT car smashes it off the road and it's in the desert, and it's the equivalent of it just going, ah, because it doesn't know what it's doing anymore because there's no road. It's just, where am I? So it just puts its foot down and it's like driving off cliffs and all this sort of stuff. And what he has to do is eventually, when it dies, it just resets and it just reappears somewhere in the middle of San Andreas. And so yeah, a lot of this I think is applicable. You know, GTA is a really great example of this, but even things like Assassin's Creed, you know, you get pulled into a world, you've got to actually obey the rules of that world. You can't just go around knifing people everywhere. Like, that's generally frowned upon regardless of whether it is a virtual society or not. I really don't encourage it. But these are really cool problems, I think, to kind of enter this virtual environment and respect those rules and kind of grow within it. So yeah, if you're remotely interested in any of this, like an awful lot of the things I'm covering here, whether it's StarCraft, the Unreal Tournament stuff, Mario, Dota, Killer Instinct, these are all actual videos that I've made that are up on YouTube, and I've also done like write-ups of these as well on like Sagama Sutra, on Medium, and on my own website, which is aiandgames.com. And yeah, that's it. Thanks very much for being here.